Thanks for joining me today. I'm artist and Corel Painter Master Aaron Rutten, and in this video I'm going to critique some digital art by one of my viewers. This is a painting of a Chameleon-Dragon painted in Photoshop CS2 by Spidey. Spidey is a student at an art college, and they're trying to make some work for their portfolio. They've never painted a dragon before, so they used a chameleon as a reference combined with their imagination, but they're getting a lot of comments that it looks unfinished and they don't know what to do next. So I'm going to share some tips with Spidey and everyone else on how to take your artwork from an unfinished stage to a more polished finished stage. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up a list of tasks here. We want to tighten the details, which means sharpen some of these areas and clean up some of these smudgy, messy edges here. We want to add some contrast. Adding some texture always helps to make things look finished. That's kind of optional. I realize that this dragon could be trying to emulate more of a traditional paint style, but if you were going for a more realistic look, you could certainly go all out and draw a whole bunch of tiny scales. We might want to vary the color a little bit because the color is a little flat, but adding a little bit of color variability will help just to kind of give this more of a feel like this creature is in an environment. And then finally, there's some blending that could be done in some of these areas that are too sharp. There's kind of a lot going on in my layers palette here. I have some notes. Spidey was nice enough to send me the layered artwork, so I actually have the eyes on a separate layer, and then multiple layers of color. And it's cool because I even get to see the sketch, and then the outline that was done from that, and then the final piece. I've gone ahead and annotated some areas of the image that I think could use a little bit of work, so those are the areas that we'll focus on. So let's start with the easiest thing, and that is improving the contrast. So a good way to evaluate the contrast in your piece is to go ahead and add a separate layer above all of the layers in your composition, and you want to fill that layer with black. Then you want to set the composite method or the blend mode to color. That's a quick and easy way to turn your artwork black and white, and then you can turn this eyeball on and off to show and hide the effect. So we can take a look at our artwork in black and white, and we can see that there's some dark areas around the eyes, but then in the wings here, and in the shadow under the leg, and maybe in the claw, it's not quite as dark, so it looks a little unfinished. There should be a nice balance of dark to light values. Let's target this leg area. This will probably be the easiest area here. I'm going to turn off this value check for a minute here. I'm going to go to my layer that I'm going to be working on. I'm going to select the airbrush, and I'm going to hold Alt, and I'm going to sample this darkest leg color. I'm just going to make it a little bit darker. Maybe I'll shift the hue a little bit towards blue also. And I'm just going to paint with a smaller brush right along the edge here, and then I'll pull down just to create a little bit of a shadow area. Made my brush a little bit bigger so that that edge is softer. You could also, of course, blend that if you want to using diffuse blur or any of your favorite blenders. And then anywhere else where we might want to add some contrast, like maybe on the crack of the arm here. Maybe we want to set this foot apart from the foot that's next to it by adding a little bit of a line between the two arms. And then along the bottom of that foot, maybe we want to add a little bit of shadow along the back side of the foot. And we're doing a couple of things here. We're improving the contrast, but we also want to use this as an opportunity to tighten up the details. So you have a lot of soft areas here, and I think that's good, but there's some areas like the spikes, the wings, the ears, anything that's kind of sharp needs to be a little tighter. Like this crease in the leg needs to be tighter. And as I'm painting, I'll kind of show you what I mean by that. But you can also tighten things up by adding contrast to edges. For instance, I'm making this foreground foot stand out more because it has a nice light area on top. I'm putting a nice sharp dark area right against it, and that makes that edge pop out to have the light right against the dark like that. It also kind of helps you clearly see that this is a leg behind the other leg. Now right now I'm doing the absolute darkest colors, so there are some lighter shadows that I'm going to add in a little bit later here. So don't go too crazy with this. See how we tightened a little bit there? There should be a nice tight crease there on the leg. Maybe we'll put a little bit on the jaw, just a little spot here. So that's it for the absolute darkest areas on the skin. Let's add some dark areas to the wings. And it's up to you if you want to just do this on whichever layers you're working on, or if you want to add separate layers. I'm going to add a separate layer. Let's call this shadows. And if you're painting shadows, it's helpful to set your composite method to multiply. I'm just going to sample that gray color and just use that same color. I don't even need to darken it because if I'm painting with multiply, it's going to darken automatically. Just add a little bit of shadow under here. You're kind of trying to match things. If it's really dark around the eyes, that would be your maximum shadow or something lighter than that. So you kind of have to make everything equal. You can't have a really dark area of your painting and then other areas that should be dark for the same reason because they're in shadow can't be so light. They have to match because you're adding shadows for a reason. You know, you're not just adding shadows just because that's the shape of the eye. That's the shape of the eye because of the shadows that are on it. The shadows are that shape because of the way that the light's projecting onto the object. You do have to do a lot of these things intentionally. Let's add a little shadow here. Maybe to the back of the wing too. That creates more contrast. It helps the edge look a little more finished too. Maybe we want to kind of separate the wing from the body here. So let's use that dark color. Add in a little bit of that. I'm just using a thin airbrush here. You could really use any brush you want, really, as long as it gives you kind of a sharp edge. If you wanted to outline a lot of this, you could too. That might kind of help it look finished, but it's up to you if you want it to be outlined or not. I think that does kind of help, but that's a stylistic choice on my part. And I always got to mention when I do these critiques that there's really no right or wrong. These are just kind of my ideas on how I think the image could be improved. Let's see how I'm tightening that up, just using a few little light lines. Again, as I mentioned, you have a lot of soft going on here, which is great because that adds the bulk of the detail, but you really kind of finish it off by adding a lot of small, sharp things, little lines and little things that are really kind of subtle. Let's add another layer. Let's call this light. These will be light areas. I'm going to sample the color from the wing here. I'm going to clean this up. Just kind of fill it in. Maybe sharpen the tips of these a little bit. I might kind of use some artistic license here because I don't exactly know what some of these areas are. So I'm just going to kind of fill them in with whatever I think they are. So I think that's part of the wing. Let's sample this lighter color from the wing. Make it a bit lighter. Tighten up this here. Like so. You always want to think about where the light's coming from. And that's already kind of been established here. So I'm just kind of following what's already been added. Background wing needs a little work. Maybe we'll go back to the shadows layer. See, I have these layers separate. That way, you know, if I'm not happy with one element of it, I don't have to erase the whole thing. So on that shadows layer, I'm just going to sample the wing color. Maybe tighten up this detail a little bit more. Need a little bit more of that lighter color, I think, down here. But I want to make sure I add that to the light layer. And if you overpaint, you can always use your eraser to go in and clean up some stuff. I'm going to create a new layer beneath the shadows. I'm going to call this mid. This will be for some midtones. Pick kind of a mid-tone green. And let's use the digital airbrush to kind of improve the contrast here on some of the areas. Clean up this edge with a smaller brush. Should be some shadows under the feet. I'm just going to go through and just kind of tighten up everything here and there. I want to make sure we set this to a multiply composite method. This is going to help the forms look a little less flat by making them more three-dimensional. And then I'm going to enhance some of the edges on the spikes just to clean those up, just painting along them with a very thin brush. At this point, I think this will be easier to work on if I go ahead and just merge all my layers down. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I just have a single layer that'll be a little bit easier to work on, because there's some areas I just want to be able to smudge around and pinch and distort. For instance, I'm going to select the pinch brush. This will be a good place to kind of tighten up some of these areas. It helps kind of smooth out the edge, make it a little less jagged. If it's too thick, sometimes that's a problem. You can also use distortion. Pull out tips like that. You see some areas of the background where there's a little bit of overpainting. I can clean those up. Just painting with white. You can see I'm working back and forth between light and dark and just cleaning up all of these edges. If I see a mistake, I'll fix a mistake. If I see a place where I can improve upon the design, I'll do that. Try to add contrast here and there and just try to clean it up. Another recommendation is to pay very careful attention to your background, because there's a lot of spillover onto the background here and it takes a lot of extra time to clean that up. So if possible, work on layers. That way you don't have to worry about spilling onto the background. So now that I've tightened up some of the details, I'm going to do a little bit of blending using diffuse blur. There's a few areas that need it. I'm going to blend out any patches and try to have nice smooth transitions, unless it's an area where it needs to be a hard transition. But we added a lot of those using the small lines already. If you overdid it on some of your sharp areas, you can always blend those too. And I'm just going to continue blending and tightening and cleaning up until I get this looking a little bit more polished. It doesn't hurt to occasionally put in some of your environment color. In that case, this is white. I'm putting that on the far side because it's reflecting. You can put a little bit of that under the chin that's reflecting off the ground. I'll do a little blending on the wings. I don't want to forget those. And I'll just add a few more details here and there just to kind of clean this up, especially on these spikes. There's a lot of spikes here, so it's going to take quite a bit of time. So that kind of gives you an idea of how you can begin to kind of clean this up. Obviously, I could spend a little more time doing this, but since this isn't my painting, I'm going to go ahead and stop here. But you would want to just keep tightening up details, cleaning up areas, smoothing out any lumpy transitions, and that'll get it looking pretty good. So let's move on to the remaining steps, which are adding texture and varying the color. I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm going to call it texture. And you could really do this in a number of ways. On this texture layer, I'm going to set it to multiply. I'm going to pick kind of a darker green color like this, and I could use the chalk or the sponge along with the paper texture to add texture. I can also change my paper and I can look for something that looks more like scales. I can change the size, add a little bit of texture like this. I'm going to make the paper scale a little bit smaller so I can do some finer scales on the extremities. And then we can zoom in, see what we have here. We may want to erase some of these. So I'm going to switch to the eraser, erase the ones on the mouth, maybe just on the underside there altogether. And if we missed any spots, we can go in and paint those in. But I think that looks pretty good. So since this texture is on its own layer, we can turn down the opacity of that layer to make it blend in a little more subtly. We can also add a mask to that layer if we want to mask away some of that by selecting black. And then we could use the chalk or the sponge or the airbrush. I think maybe I'll use the sponge. And just in a few places, paint over it. That'll kind of break up that pattern and make it less uniform. You can see now it's a little more variable. You could also deform it if you wanted to using the distortion, bulge, and pinch brushes, but I think this is good enough for some texture. And you can also add texture by blending. For instance, I can go to my layer here. I could select the coarse oily blender, and depending on which paper texture I select, I can also get a little bit of texture when I blend. If I zoom in, you can see that there. I'm going to change to a different paper. Let's try the pebble board. Something a little more contrasty will increase the contrast. And now you can see that texture that's being created That kind of helps it look a little more organic and painterly. So here and there you can kind of blend things up. Be careful not to go over any sharp critical areas. Like if I paint here, I'm going to mess up my wing. So I want to avoid that area. And then I'll go to the diffuse blur and I'll blend a little bit over that just to tame it down a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and just maybe improve the composition a bit here because I feel like this feels a little more balanced to me. And now let's vary the color a little bit. I'm going to add a new layer. I'm going to call it overlay. I'm going to set the composite method to overlay. And let's pick a fun color like this purple. And let's go ahead and just fill the canvas with that color. You can see that already had a really cool effect on the dragon. Now let's add a mask to that layer. We'll select black and the airbrush. And now we can just mask out part of that effect. We can switch to white and we can bring some of it back. Maybe try to concentrate it mainly in the shadow areas to cool those off. And since this overlay is on its own layer, we can reduce the opacity if we want it to be a little more subtle. Let's create another overlay layer. Let's pick another color. Let's try making this green pop out a little bit more. Let's use a bright green like this. That looks good to me. Let's add a mask to that. Select black, select the airbrush, and just mask away the shadow areas. Reduce the opacity of that layer a bit. And if we do a before and after, you can really see the effect that this is having. I think it's fine starting out to paint things in kind of a flat tone like you would imagine it, but then to change it up and make it look a little more realistic, you have to vary the color a little bit. So I think that's all I'm going to do to this piece. Hopefully that gives Spidey and everyone else some tips on how to tighten up and finalize their artwork. Let's go ahead and take a look at the before and after. And you can see that made quite a dramatic change. If you're interested in getting your own artwork critiqued, feel free to send your submissions to aaronrutten@gmail.com. If you can send me the layered file, that's even better. If not, just send me a flat copy. And just make sure to include permission for me to use your artwork in the email. If you like this video, take a quick second to click the like button and share it with your friends. And if you're new to my channel, make sure to click the subscribe button to get updates when I release new videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.